Hey all, today we're going to start chapter 2. We're going to break chapter 2 into two parts, and so this is part 1. We're going to talk about displaying categorical data. So the book uses the example of the Titanic, and so I'm going to just follow along with that idea. And just as a historical note, the Titanic sank April 14th, 1912. And so if they looked at the passengers on board and they collected a bunch of information about them, what we could do is we could display that information into a data table. So here's a snippet of what that data table might look like. Okay, so we can see if the person survived, which age category they were in, if they were an adult or a child, their gender, and then what class they were in. So class meaning they're a first class passenger, and you can think about airplanes, first class passengers, typically the more wealthy passengers. Second class, third class passengers, those would be the ones who had probably the least amount of money. And of course there's crew on deck. This is one way we can display categorical data. It's not super helpful. They probably have way more information than this as well. So if we really want to dive deeper into one of those characteristics, we can create what's called a frequency table. So here we want to take a closer look at the number of people on the ship and which class they were in. So on the left here, we have a frequency table. We just have the categories, or in this case, the classes, first, second, third, and the crew. And then we just have a count of how many people belonged in that category. So there's 325 first class, 885 crew members. And to take that one step further, we can create a relative frequency table. And so what we would do is take each count and divide it by the total number of passengers, and we would get a percentage, or we would get a proportion, a fraction of the total. And so these four percentages should add up to 100. So we can see that the crew made up 40% of everybody on board. There were approximately 13% second class passengers, 32% third class, and close to 15% first class. And so what this relative frequency table does, it gives us a distribution of that categorical variable. So we can see just how the people were distributed according to what class they fit into. One thing to keep in mind when you're trying to create a data display, and we create data displays because when we want to talk about statistics, it's very important to make pictures, visual representations of our data. We have to keep in mind the area principle. So if we look at this picture that I took from the book of the Titanic, and it's trying to display the amount of people in each class. So we do know that the crew made up a larger portion of all of the people on board, but it's a little misleading looking at the size of this Titanic picture versus the size of these Titanic pictures. They're not exactly to scale, and so what's happening here is we're not following the area principle. And so when we draw some sort of data display for a categorical variable, we need to make sure that the area occupied corresponds to the magnitude of its value. And so this is a really fancy and eye-catching display, but it's not really representing what we want it to. So instead of that, we can use different types of displays that you're probably familiar with, bar charts and pie charts. Here we have a simple bar chart. All we did was take the counts in each category, and we made a bar, and all these bars are the same thickness. And so the way that we know one is a bigger amount than the other is it's taller. and their heights correspond to how many people were in each class. And we can go further, and we can make a relative frequency bar chart from our relative frequency table. And again, their heights represent the percentage of the total number of people in each category. So again, you can see that the crew made up the largest percentage of all people on board. And of course, we can make a pie chart which shows us each group and its fraction of the entire population on the boat. So it's another good visual representation that this 885 crew members looks like it was just about half of the total number of people on the boat. So it's important to note that in order to use a categorical data display, the data has to be categorical. That means that it has to be counts of individuals that go into a category or have a certain characteristic. So in this case, we're counting the number of people in each class, first, second, third, and crew. And one of the last type of table we'll talk about today, we call a contingency table. So it was nice to look at the distribution of the classes, the people, and which class they fit into, but it might be interesting to look at how many people in each class lived through the tragedy or passed away. So we can create what's called a contingency table. And here, going horizontally, we have the 4 different classes. And here, vertically, we have whether or not passengers survived. And then we have these sort of this row down here and this column over here that are totals. So this is the total number of people who've lived, total who died, and there's the total again that we looked at before of the number of people in each class. And these cells right here are counts for the combination of variables. So there were 203 first class members who lived and 122 who died. Similarly, there's 212 crew members who lived, 673 who died. And then there's the total. This column and this row should both add up to the total 2,201 people on board. So we can look and compare or try to get an idea of did people survive at the same rate based on their class, or did maybe their class affect whether or not they lived or died? And that becomes a little bit easier if we put those into percentages. And I want to note too here before I move on that this row and this column that I highlighted in yellow we would call marginal distributions. So this is the distribution of class, this is the distribution of survival. So if we take each of these cells and divide it by the total, we can find out the percentage of, say, first class passengers who lived. I'm sorry, the percentage of people on the boat who were first class passengers and lived, sorry. And what percentage died, and same thing for second, third, and the crew. And we already knew that 40% of the people were crew, but here we can see that 30% of the people who died were crew members. And so you can definitely see that you are more likely to not survive if you are a crew member or if you were a third-class passenger. And so you can draw some conclusions on that. One might be that first-class passengers probably got onto the smaller boats first. So that's it for today. I have a question for you to answer. If you have questions, please remember to ask me in class, and we will work on practicing some of this stuff together.